Thanks, Tim. As Tim said, sensitive intervention points and pragmatic policies for achieving net zero. I'm looking at a particular case study just to illustrate some of the points, which is achieving net zero for electricity in the UK. I'm part of the post-carbon transition program at Oxford Martin School, but I'm also a member of the New Economic Thinking, so hopefully you'll see a little bit of New Economic Thinking. And this work was a collaboration effort, part of a collaboration effort with a number of different universities in the UK. So the inspiration for this work, I was deeply inspired by the Paris Agreement, so it's nice to be here a few years later. That's Boris Johnson in a former role as the Foreign Minister, signing it. Probably was just as confused back then as well. But it was a fantastic thing that inspired me to make use of the modelling that I have. Also, around the same time, there was this report that came out in the UK government about advocating carbon capture and storage, sorry for the acronym, and the lowest cost decarbonisation, whether carbon capture and storage was a part of that. So you'll see my piece of modelling that looks at that question of whether that is the case for electricity anyway. Another thing that Hector talked about is some of the results coming out of the integrated assessment models, which to me give a misleading message to decision makers as to how best and how much it will cost to tackle climate change. I'm picking on one particular model, CG, the outputs, the abatement rate. Once you're up to 1, you've got rid of all your emissions. That top pathway there is to meet the 2-degree target, and the carbon price required to do that is over $1,000 per tonne, which seems extremely high considering there's probably a backstop measure there like greenhouse gas removals. It's going to be no more than possibly about $200 a tonne. So how is it that they're getting up to such high carbon prices? And what different message would that give to decision makers if that wasn't the case, if it was something closer to $100 a tonne? As Hector alluded to, there's been a few people that have, fairly well-known people that have commented on the capabilities of some of these models, but they're still heavily used in decision making. So, what was the UK's decarbonisation goals? Well, there's been several of them, and they've met pretty much all of them so far, so go UK. The Kyoto Protocol, we met that, one of the few that did. Yeah. They say there's something about the English people that once you give them a rule, they just can't help themselves, they've got to follow it. And then maybe that explains Brexit. But if you look at the Paris Agreement, we're well ahead of that. That's a 40% reduction because that's the EU as a whole. The grey lines are the most recent reductions. That's taking into account buying credit off the emissions trading scheme, so there's a little bit of a cheat in that to some respects. But there's been 2 versions of the Climate Change Act, which is what the UK piece of legislation that requires decarbonisation of the UK. There was an 80% reduction by 2050 target, and more recently a net zero target, and I'll be looking at those. Most of those reductions that you see there are actually from energy switching from coal to gas. But there have been reductions in efficiency measures and waste from energy and so forth that have helped in that process. There's a piece of modelling that we did that we're making use of. It was a consortium of UK universities that put this together. We work with Infrastructure UK to take all the pipeline projects that were being built, like Hinkley Point C, the nuclear reactor, put it in our model of national infrastructure to see how it impacted on future supply. We also worked with another couple of agencies, including the National Infrastructure Commission, looking at a long-term infrastructure assessment for the UK to 2050. So the model got calibrated to all the government future prices and cost scenarios and so forth. The NISMOD model is fairly simple in design. You take scenarios of future economic growth, climate growth, so there's no economic model except for it's given as a scenario. It's actually a Cambridge econometrics model. So I'm not showing economic modelling. We use economic modelling in this. but you've got climate change and so forth, technology. You run that through the model, which has a number of different sectors, infrastructure sectors, and you see how well different strategies that you come up with do given those scenarios, and you have some metrics to check the performance of those individual models. So a simulation, but it has some optimization in it as well, which I'll talk about. It's a model of medium level complexity, so it doesn't have every road in the UK, but it has a certain amount of transport between each of the different regions of the UK. It's even simpler in terms of the electricity network. There's only 16 bus bars in there, but it's realistic from an engineering point of view in the fact that if you have more wind power put up in the North Sea, it knows to what degree you can get a certain amount of capacity out of that. And if it has to build extra transmission lines to get that power to the main grid, it will, and it'll cost that into the model. It's also unique in the fact that we've got these different infrastructure models all coupled together running against the same socio-economic and climate scenarios, and even more unique in the fact that we couple those models together. So you can look at, for instance, in what I'm showing, that the transport sector requires a lot of energy, and also the water sector provides a lot of water for cooling towers for the energy sector, and also waste energy as well. So, looking at some alternative strategies, this is the economics component of this. To look at this problem, as we talked about, there's a number of market failures that you have to deal with in this dealing with climate change and getting to net zero. Obviously, a lot of people talk about underpriced carbon emissions. There's also barriers to entry, as was alluded to, trying to get those new technologies into the market against the incumbents, particularly around research and development. And also one that's not talked about so much necessarily is the incomplete information. So we represent that in this model as uncertainty around future electricity demand, carbon prices and fuel costs. Now in traditional economics, if you have a problem where you've got one market failure, to try and correct for that market failure when there's more than one market failure may lead to results that are not necessarily optimal, that can actually make things worse. I probably shouldn't be going through the economics of this, but basically if you have, for instance, two failures, you've got a monopolist and he's polluting. If you impose a tax on that monopolist, he will reduce his output, reduce the emissions, but there will also be an impact in price on the consumers. And how well that policy works for society as a whole will depend between the trade-off of those two. So that's two market failures, and carbon prices don't necessarily give you the best result if you're only looking at carbon prices. There's a curious statement in this basically saying that in all cases people don't actually understand everything that's going on, so you will always have a second market failure, incomplete information. So there's pretty much no situation where you don't have that. And I see Lars shaking his head, but that'd be an interesting conversation where incomplete information wasn't the case. So we've got, in this model, you could have complete certainty. We can run the model across the entire 50 years and come up with the optimal. Instead, we look at planning horizons. So looking at reducing how far into the future the decision makers can see, bound to rationality or whatever you want to call it, and you can reduce that down depending on how much you think that the investors can see of the future. And that's a reality in the UK. Not too long ago, the government decided that it was going to ramp up the carbon price floor that the UK uses up to £30, £1 a year. It got 2 years into that, the businesses started complaining, and then it got set to a flat rate of 18 for the next 5 years. So that's uncertainty that the investors have to take into account when they're deciding on what to invest in. So we simulated that in the model. And basically, the shorter you have their planning horizon, the more it costs, which is quite obvious in many ways. As I said, we've got these different scenarios. They're plausibility scenarios, so they look at population growth possibilities. The blue line there is actually from a Bayes scenario. It matches a Bayes scenario. You see a little upturn up there. That was what Hector was talking about future technologies and what we don't know about those future technologies. That is actually what they believe will happen into the future, that there will be pretty much steady demand in electricity because of efficiencies that are coming in. But in our model, we have those inflection curves, those S-shaped uptakes of different technologies. But what happens when you have replaced every light bulb with LEDs? What's next? You know, bioluminescent wallpaper. We don't know, and so the model doesn't have those technologies, so it starts actually increasing its demand. So there is some uncertainty there that we can't encapsulate. The high scenario there is incorporating one of the bigger uncertainties, which is heat. Heat is the biggest energy demand in our UK economy. It's far bigger than electricity at the moment. And so if you start trying to electrify that, that'll increase the demand for electricity significantly. So we put that in the model, as well as electrification of transport. We go up to about 23 million electric cars. That's not the entire fleet. That's about half of the fleet. But there's a certain engineering believability to how much you can actually push that. In terms of what could actually happen. So a number of different scenarios, the strategies that we use to test out these different policies, looking at carbon prices, those different market failures and dealing with them, the different options that we have. So there's a number of different carbon price scenarios. There's a cap and trade, similar to the emissions trading scheme. There's mandating particular technologies, so promoting R&D in renewables or in CCS. And then finally, this last one is based on a piece of research done out of INET, looking at these technologies that we talked about, the solar, wind, storage, and the non-linear progress that's happening in these technologies in terms of their costs. So that's a log normal scale along the bottom. So you've got oil and gas, the grey and black, in terms of they take up most of the energy capacity of the world, so they're over on this side. But you see their prices are not doing much. They're kind of stagnating where they are, whereas solar and wind, as they increase their deployment, and the experience curves are basically, this is Wright's law that they're expressing here, based on the more you deploy. So whenever you double your deployment, you reduce your cost by about 18%, so but you've got to keep doubling it. And so they're envelopes of possibilities, and we've put some of those numbers into this model to see what they actually mean if the world as a whole pushes renewables as hard as they can. Just to see if that changes any of the outcomes. It's a bit of a confusing graph, and I've tried to break it down for you, a set of graphs. Up the top there is the emissions each year for two different scenarios. You've got a low carbon price regime, the carbon price just stays low, or you've got a carbon price regime that Stiglitz and Stern have promoted that is necessary in order to achieve net zero. And sure enough, in our model, it shows that you actually get below that 80% target. So I'm just looking at the 80% target there. Then I looked at also having just a straight line carbon emission, carbon price pathway. The difference between those two is that the red line is actually necessary. With the myopic investors, that red line is necessary to promote CCS. You have to actually get the carbon price high enough so that they are willing to invest in those high capital investment technologies. So in the orange line, it doesn't actually it eventually gets to the target, but it doesn't get there as quickly. But you can also get stranded assets if you push it too hard. But that's not one of the main focuses of this research. And in terms of results, the green line is the costs, cumulative cost up to 2050 of each of the strategies. And the bars, the vertical bars, are the cumulative CO2. So the first one there doesn't meet the Climate Change Act, and you get a lot of emissions. The other two meet the Climate Change Act, but you have varying amounts of cumulative CO2 you put in the atmosphere before you get there. Interestingly, the Climate Change Act has nothing to say about how many cumulative CO2 emissions you put in the atmosphere, it just has a target. So both meet the goals. And then you can look at those other strategies that I mentioned there. So the grey one is the cap and trade, which you keep on ramping down how many emissions everyone is allowed, and they trade, and a carbon price emerges out of that. And then you push renewables as the green one, or you push CCS is the blue one. And the last one is that if the global whole invests in renewables and pushes those experience curves down. And I'll look at that one a bit closely. The bars there are the low and high scenarios that I mentioned earlier with population economic growth. So the one on the left doesn't meet the Climate Change Act. All the others do, varying levels of cumulative CO2 emissions. And what can you see when you look at the different costings? So this is fairly simple cost-benefit ratio. In these three strategies, you do have cost optimization. They're trying to minimise their costs, which is a fairly believable assumption, but within that myopic investment framework. What you also see is that this one's business unusual on that side. This is global renewables, that the cost for that scenario is less, even if you don't put a carbon price on that strategy at all. So both have zero, the lowest possible carbon price regime, but it's actually a cleaner world, but it's also a cheaper world. And if you look at the different energy mixes, it all kind of makes sense. Some have a certain amount of CCS, and then you have more and more renewables the further you go to the right there, except for this where you push CCS as hard as you can. So this all looked like a fairly nice piece of research, and I was just about to publish this when disaster strikes. Now, what are you thinking that's going to be? A Sith Lord has entered the UK Parliament? No. Brexit? No, it wasn't Brexit. It was Theresa May signing the net zero target. I had a paper that achieved the 80% reductions, and she goes ahead and does that. I'm probably the only academic in Oxford that was unhappy about that. But actually what happened was rather interesting. Like, I went back to the modelling and put in, well, how do I achieve net zero by 2050, and what does that actually mean for the modelling? And I get very different results for one strategy in particular. Now this is the same, only squashed together. The two bars, one is the 80% reduction, the other one is the achieving net zero for each of the different strategies. The green line is the same, the cost. The purple line is for achieving net zero. They all are fairly much the same, except for this CCS strategy, where the cost goes up dramatically, and it's actually even higher than that. So I've got a little arrow at the end there. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One in particular is that with carbon capture and storage, you only capture a certain amount. You're capturing 20%. You're not capturing about 20% of those emissions. So there's this residual. This is from a piece of work we did looking at around the world the amount of emissions from different technologies. Europe gets a lot of its gas from Russia, which you can imagine don't particularly do a great job of bringing out their, curtailing leakages and so forth. So even though this is from the world and some of the worst emissions are from the developing world, it still applies to the UK context. And so if you take 20% of those emissions from downstream, that's from the power plants, you've got about an extra 10 megatons of CO2 every year that you've got to somehow remove out of the atmosphere. Added to that, as I said, is if you're getting your gas from Russia or somewhere like that, you've got a fair amount of leakages that you have to take into account, which are not in this model because those leakages are happening elsewhere, but there's something to take into account. And how do you deal with those? Well, you've got greenhouse gas removal technologies. We heard a lot about afforestation in the past 2 days and the problems there. You read a lot about BECCS, Bennett Bioenergy, with carbon capture and storage in a lot of these integrated assessment models, mainly because you reduce your emissions, you get negative emissions, and you also get energy out of it. Direct air capture, there's a few companies out there saying that they've solved that one. Surprisingly, the one that looks like the most promising is enhanced weathering. You basically break down silicates and you spread them over your fields, and there's a lot of silicate around the world that you can use, and it just soaks CO2 up out of the atmosphere over time. The guys in that at Oxford are saying that's about $50 a tonne if you add it to other processes. But in my model, I costed it £150 a tonne, and I don't have any build rate limitations. But in the CCS, one of the arguments of the Oxburg report is if you put in CCS technologies and if you ramp up those technologies, it's going to make this cheaper. Well, to make it parallel with new renewables in this model, you'd have to get it down to less than 20 pounds per tonne of CO2. So it's hard for this methodology to beat renewables. Another problem, because we can couple with a water model, we've got climate change impacting on our UK water model. And then you look at, well, what if we put CCS on all these different plants? And this is a bit of work that Ed Byers did with Jim Hall. And in particular places where things are dry, you've basically doubled your water intake, and it can have a significant impact, particularly when you're going through a drought, that you need to take into account. So just a summary of that policy evaluation. So the government sets a carbon price regime. The uncertainty in the future makes it difficult to set any sort of optimal carbon price. You can see that what carbon price you set brings about different actions by the market. And knowing what the future demand or prices is going to be adds to that uncertainty. So giving the market certainty definitely decreases the costs, which is a reason why the Climate Change Act is important. Looking at cap and trade, which is what we've got in the UK mostly, the EU. One problem is if it's not synced well with the decommissioning of different plants, then you can actually get some stranded assets out of that approach. Whether they're stranded in terms of their finance is another matter, but certainly they're not used as long as they could be. And if governments mandate certain technologies, as I pointed out by the contrast between the 80% and the net zero, you could create path dependencies. When I pulled back that CCS strategy and said, well, what if I put in less CCS? And then what if I put even less CCS? The way it got down to its cost minimal is if I put in no CCS in the end. So you'd have to basically change train tracks to a completely different strategy if you went down that path. Now I'm just talking about electricity here, so that's a caveat on that. And there's also a bit of a dirty secret to the renewable strategies. Because of their intermittency in the model, we rely heavily on the interconnector with the EU, and the emissions from the EU are not incorporated in this modelling. They're not incorporated in the Climate Act as well, so that's not accounted for in the model. But I think the UK government will be fairly pleased with the results of this, in that there's a combination there of cap and trade, incentives, renewables, and a carbon price floor, which is exactly what the UK has got. And I would argue if Brexit does unfortunately happen, that's probably what they should adopt going forward. So that sounds all much like fairly pragmatic policy evaluation, nothing too surprising there possibly, and nothing too new economic thinking. So where are these sensitive intervention points, these tipping points that we've been talking about over the last few days? So we're looking at tipping points in socioeconomic systems. You've heard about climate tipping points and ecosystem tipping points. So these are kicks and shifts to the system that you can make to make use of some of these dynamics, the system dynamics that allow outsized results, runaway change. In this case, we're looking for decarbonisation. When the ball's finally rolling down that hill, you want that amplification effect, that more of X produces more of Y produces more of X. So where was it in the modelling that I just presented there? There's actually 3 sensitive intervention points that I've incorporated into this modelling. First one, the Climate Change Act. The Climate Change Act actually happened in 2008 when there was a window of opportunity. David Cameron wanted to detoxify the Conservatives. They even changed their logo to something green. There was bipartisan support for the Climate Change Act. There was institutional rigidity created in that day because several years later, when the global financial crisis was starting to hit UK, he wanted to get rid of the Climate Change Act, but it had already got enough bipartisan support that he couldn't. How does that work in terms of the feedback mechanisms? It's a bit hard to see in this case, but you can see that having legislation creates expectations that there will be change, which reinforces those expectations once the emissions start dropping, so investors can see that's the way to go. A little more obvious is the choosing different technology investments, promoting those that have these experience curves, which have been known for some time to have a positive feedback. The more you deploy, the less the costs get. The more people demand it, the more you deploy, the lower the costs get. The guys at INET have been looking at this for quite some time and predicting what's been happening, and they've predicted similar sort of trends into the future and shown that it is quite predictable. And finally, in terms of better modelling, if I take what I've done in this modelling and put it into the context of how I showed you the outputs of the integrated assessment models look and fit it into those curves, you see we achieved the net zero target. This is just for one sector in one country. But in terms of costs, it presents a very different picture, particularly those bottom lines. That's a low carbon price that met the Climate Change Act. It achieved net zero, which you're not seeing in any of these modelling efforts for all the reasons possibly Hector covered and a few more that Jean-Francois is going to cover. So conclusions, greater certainty is a good thing. So the UK Climate Act is a particularly powerful piece of legislation, and I wish my home country of Australia had something similar. One state does, Victoria. Best thing they've ever done. Setting a final goal to net zero is important. As you saw, the 80% interim target could lead you down a path dependency that could be costly. Carbon capture and storage, particularly in electricity. Now, there might be an argument for it in heat, and that's further research that we can look into. But you should take into account water demands as well as greenhouse gas removal requirements. And decision makers need to be taking sensitive intervention points into account. It's difficult in a lot of these CG models. You require equilibrium, and the non-linear effects of technologies are difficult to incorporate because you get multiple solutions and so forth. For God's sakes, just abandon equilibrium. It doesn't exist except on the moon. There, thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We've run a tiny bit over, but let's take a question if there is one. That was great. Everybody getting hungry? All right. Up at the back. And then Michael. Okay, can we try to keep the questions short, please?
Yeah, so it's very fascinating and ambitious policy analysis. One thing I was just curious about, how easy it is to attach uncertainty to these measurements of the policy outcome. So presumably you were giving us exact numbers of what was going to happen if we did X, Y, and Z. And presumably there's lots of uncertain inputs into this complex modeling. Is it very easy to kind of also give us some sense of the uncertainty of the answers you're producing?
Well, the bars that I showed against the different costs are from the low and high scenarios. The major caveat for me is that I'm achieving net zero for electricity. I'm not achieving net zero for the country as a whole. And so the carbon prices for those integrated assessment models usually have some non-linear pathway that they push on the model. Partly that's to deal with some of these more intractable problems like land use change and some of the stuff that we've seen at the previous 2 days of this workshop. So there's a massive caveat there in terms of the uncertainty of achieving net zero for some of the other sectors. It's particularly easy for electricity, which is partly why I chose it, but your point's well made that there is much bigger uncertainty that's not shown in this model.
Okay. Michael?
You said this wonderful thing about the person that most people in this room like to hate, the Iron Lady. But the dirty secret I was whispered in my ear by somebody who was at some meeting, it has to do with the fact that she really just wanted to break the back of the miners' unions.
Oh, you've gone back. Sorry. You've gone to our previous female Prime Minister. We were talking about Theresa May, not Margaret Thatcher. But
My wife's grandfather is actually Sir Ian McGregor, who is the man of steel that actually convinced Margaret Thatcher to not give up and push the coal miners as far as they can go. So I've got a bit of an intimate relationship with that whole argument. All my family's from Yorkshire, so I've seen all the depravity that's caused. I've heard the same thing. It's true that the Climate Change Act was actually born out of Margaret Thatcher wanting to break the back of the coal unions. That's how it actually originated into the UK, the Conservative the Conservatives, the Tories. We had Lord Merton speak at the 1.5 Degrees conference in Oxford, and he gave a very impassioned speech about climate change, and then came over to me for some reason, I didn't know him, and said, "So what did you think about that?" I said, "God, I've got to tell you, mate, the Conservatives in this country are very different from the Conservatives in my country. The way you're pushing climate change action is quite impressive." And he said, "Oh, yes, we have a different history in our country. The lords of our country come from the parsonage days of looking after your people. The tradition of us looking after our serfs and that are beholden to us." Which as an Australian, that kind of put my nose out of joint that, you're looking after us, thanks Dad. But it's nice to see that there is a country where the Conservatives, it's not a political issue, that it is something that's supported by both sides.
I'm surprised by the fact that you mentioned carbon storage and capture. Is it really a mature technology nowadays? I mean...
Yeah, there's quite a few sites around the world. Mostly it's been used for enhanced oil recovery. The US have just passed a bit of legislation that provides a certain amount of money. I think it's about $30 per tonne for enhanced oil recovery. You push it down, more oil comes out. You can get a reduction in emissions from that process. They offer 45 for carbon capture and storage, so no oil coming out, just capturing it. But I don't think anyone's taken that up. There are several sites around the world that are capturing storage. The Norwegians have been doing it for many years out on the North Sea. And they're contemplating some fairly big carbon capture and storage projects. And it might make sense for them dealing with the fact that they own 1% of the planet, and they're still selling a lot of oil and gas that's possibly going to reduce all those assets down dramatically if they don't do something about emissions.
Okay, very quickly, please.
You're talking about carbon capture from the source, right, which is very different from scrubbing CO2 out of the
Yeah.
it's already been emitted in the atmosphere.
Yeah. It's similar technology because you're just capturing it at a point source versus capturing it from the atmosphere. You're still putting it...
Different. I mean, the energetic requirements of extracting 400 molecules out of a million.
Sure.
But the major net removal thing that's in the game is biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. So you let the plants do the difficult thermodynamics, and then it's capture in a power station. It's a concentrated source. But yeah, point taken.
Also, some of the technology improvements in carbon capture and storage are in how they're actually capturing it out of the gases. And if you can push the gases through fast enough, once you improve that technology, you can reduce the costs of capture. So you can have CCS improving the costs of greenhouse gas removal technology.
All right, let's thank Matt and all three speakers for a stimulating session.